All right, Renee.
This is Senate Appropriations, and we're taking up a bill H480. It was just referred to us this morning. It's a act relating to property valuation and reappraisals. I'm sure many of us have heard from our towns regarding the bill, particularly as it was passed out of the other body. So we have Chair of our Senate Gov Ops to bring us up to date in terms of what has happened to the bill. I think there is an appropriation in here of $50,000, which is covered. So you want to just run through the bill as you passed it out. There's a minor amendment that came from finance, but really the work and the strike all was all done in your committee. So thank you for coming down this morning.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, I'm Ruth Hardy, the Senator from Addison and the Chair of GovOps. So H480 came over to us from the other body as a familiar kind of concept where they implemented something in the future and then studied it until they got to the implementation, which was to have the state Department of Tax take over property reappraisals from the local listers and appraisers.
Wholesale.
Fairly wholesale. That was in the original bill. They did have in the bill a bunch of study and research and planning to do before that, but it was a sort of prospective kind of assumption that the state would take it over. As you can imagine, there were a lot of people who were not happy with that. So I was excited that it came to the GovOps committee, and we really looked at it from the perspective of state government and local government and how, you know, what the two roles were. So what we did was we took out the assumption that it was going to go to a state reappraisal system, but we kept in the study and sort of planning and data collection portion of the program and really beefed that up and made it more comprehensive. The one thing that we did keep in the bill and that we heard really from everyone was that our property reappraisals should be on a schedule. Right now, the trigger for reappraisal, exactly. Right now, in current law, the trigger for reappraisals is the common level of appraisal. And if a town's common level appraisal gets to more than 115% or less than 85% of the statewide common level of appraisal, they have to reappraise. So the bill takes out the CLA trigger and asks the department to come up with a statewide schedule for reappraising based on a 6-year schedule. 6 years is the sort of national best practices standard to do reappraisals. And they would have to do that starting with reappraisals that are completed by 2027. I think it's January 1st, 2027. Those reappraisals, usually it takes about 2 years to do it. Those reappraisals would start in 2025 and be completed in 2027. So that's when the schedule, the 6-year schedule kicks in. So it's not immediate. They have time to sort of work on the schedule. And one of the concepts for the schedule is that, so right now, towns are having a really hard time finding reappraisers. There's just a backlog right now, actually, until 2027. So the ones that are sort of in the queue will probably be in the first year or so of the cycle. And the thought is if they're on a schedule, it would be known, and the department could make the schedule so that would say, well, we're going to do all of Orleans County this year, and that, you know, are these 20 towns, and that would give reappraisal firms the incentive to bid on reappraising that, because it would be enough of a job for them to be worth it. Whereas saying, oh, we're going to just reappraise you know, one town each year is just not enough of a job for a lot of these firms, and they're not bidding on them. And the local listers and appraisers aren't able to keep up or don't have the training to do the full town-wide reappraisal. So that's the one thing that actually gets.
Is that where NEMRIC comes in?
Pardon me?
NEMRIC, is that?
So NEMRIC is I can't remember what it stands for, is one of the national sort of organizations of reappraisers.
Okay, but they would be one of, like, who would be conducting a reappraisal then?
No,
Yes.
they're actually the system for
Yeah,
the
yeah,
IT
they're-
system.
Oh, they're an IT system?
They're the IT system for the grand list.
Oh, thank
Yeah.
you.
You're the, and
sorry.
for accounting for towns as
Oh.
well.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. So, a lot of them are private firms that are out-of-state firms. There are a few in-state firms, and then there are the actual.
This is gonna be mostly appraisal out of state.
Well, I think that there are local firms that do it as well. There's what we heard from several of the local firms that would, you know, appreciate having consistent, you know, a schedule for their work. The bill then asks the tax department to do a whole bunch of studying for whether or not it makes sense for the state to do reappraisals, or if it makes sense to continue to have the locals do it. The one thing about.
Let's go back to what we're doing is setting a schedule for
Correct.
reappraisal.
Setting a schedule.
How it's done could still be done by the local appraiser.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to connect your comment about contracting. That could happen now, I gather.
Yes.
But just the schedule itself doesn't drive the work out of state.
I wouldn't think so, and right now towns are actually trying to do it by themselves, trying to be like, hey, we heard you need to be reappraised, can we band together and do it? But it's not as organized, and this would be the state really organizing, and they would do it in conjunction with the locals. There's a lot of, you know, in consultation with, and they would be working with the LCT and VALA, which is the Vermont Association of Listers and Assessors. I mentioned that the CLA trigger goes away. The coefficient of dispersion stays in effect, so that if there's a wide range within a town of property valuations, that's a trigger saying, hey, you're within this municipality, the properties are, there's a lot of inequity. So that would stay in place as a trigger for reappraisal.
I always love that. The coefficient of dispersion.
It's my favorite rock band.
It is a great rock band, yeah, for a bunch of geeks.
Did you, I don't mean to,
No.
I do disagree. I think that given the number of appraisal firms that there are, and given the way the system works now, it is going to drive a lot of the appraisals to out of state, and particularly the technical stuff. If it's just going through and doing residential appraisals, it's very different than doing commercial appraisals. And this, we just don't have enough appraisers out there, and they aren't doing a very good job of figuring out a way to train the people to do that. Does this do?
Yes, in fact, there is a section in the bill. Abby, I'm gonna ask you to help me out. The section's about the training.
Section 6, maybe, lister and appraisal education.
Section 6, that's
100,000 each year to be paid.
Well, it's not section 6.
It starts on, yes, that's correct. For the Senate Government Operations Proposal Amendment, it starts on section 6 and it goes through section 9.
So that this House started this, and we added to it essentially beefing up the training for appraisers in the state, including both contracted appraisers and the elected listers and appraisers at the local level. And it would increase the training and also add some things in. There was a lot of testimony, especially in the House, but we also got some really good testimony on how bias comes into reappraisals. And usually it's implicit bias, but it can be impacted based on where a property is in a town, what kind of property it is, who owns the property. So there's racial bias, there's class bias. And so integrated into the training is
It's also biased to gig up the amount of evaluation on enrolled land. Because then the money we have to pay to make the municipalities whole, is higher.
So this would integrate bias training, or anti-bias training into the appraisal training system. So yes, so starting on the bottom of page 11 is the assessment education, and there already is a program for education that the state uses, but this would increase it, and it does provide additional funding from the education fund to the division to PBR to do this test, to do this training. So that was something that the finance committee would have looked at.
This is all really getting into the integrity and defense of the statewide grand list.
Right. Right, and so they, it's relevant to both the state and the municipal property valuation.
So in the 6 years, if the town's last appraisal was in 18, does that mean they would have to do it in 2024?
Not necessarily. So the first scheduled properties would be basically who is the ones that are most urgent right now, the ones that have already been triggered under current law, and where the tax department sort of feels like they need to start.
It's not 6 year math, it's kind of like a rolling 6 years going forward.
Right.
And that's what the plan is gonna be, like by county or groups of towns or whatever.
Right, and it's not spelled out how they have to do it in the bill. A lot of it is that they need to figure that out, and there are a number of checkbacks. Again, the phrase of this, that they, so the first one is in, sorry, I didn't know this bill was gonna move today, so I'm not as organized as I should be. But the progress report, the first one is December 15th of 2023, and then there's another one, December 15th of 2024, and then things start to go into effect. The 6 year schedule starts to go into effect for reappraisals that start in 25 and then finish in 27. There is, sorry.
And then, are you finished answering that question? Otherwise, we'll move on. In terms of the Senator Perchlik's question about the 6 years.
Yeah. So they'll get, and there also is the possibility that the director of PBR can sort of modify the schedule for good reasons. So if there's a town that really needs to be reappraised or really doesn't,
or they can authorize a longer period of time.
They can authorize a change in the schedule. Yeah.
Senator Starr.
I don't know. The towns already know if they're getting to the point where they're either too low or too high, and they already hire professionals to come and do the reappraisals. So I don't know, why are we trying to invent a new wheel here or tell them how to do it? I mean, they're already doing it, and I know that's what's happening up in the kingdom. And
well, we know that particularly maybe residential property may be a different category, but we know that some complex properties, for example, the hydro dams, those all had to be done.
the towns are hiring professional assessors.
We actually paid to have that go out to bid in the tax department to bring in a professional assessor because who lives in a town that has someone with a expertise to do hydro
Okay.
dams.
But that's not uncommon. They come in communities that have condominium developments for recreation, and they're, on the commercial side of, reappraisal, towns usually pick certain categories and go out and they hire people to do that work that are in that piece. I do have a question.
Yep.
So what happens in this to the fees that are paid out to towns each year?
The per parcel.
The
Yeah,
per
so
parcel.
In the House version of the bill, those were removed and there was an appropriation for the state to do that. In the Senate GovOps version, we left that alone, so it's the current, they would still get the $8.50, except for Abby, I think there was a, no, it just keeps them the same. Yeah, we didn't change them at all. So the towns would still get them. That would be up for discussion if there was a proposal, if they came back with a proposal to do the statewide reappraisal. And to just, so yeah, we leave them alone. And to your point, the complex property, last year, Senator Westman and I actually worked on the bill together that would create the program for complex property valuation assistance at the state level, and that goes into effect July 1st of this year.
Like a water park.
Yeah, or in my district, a major digester in the town of Salisbury, which is a pretty complex property, and they've already asked the state for help with that. So that was something we did last year. This bill doesn't change that. It still goes into effect this year.
My community has timeshares.
Another thing
sorry, the question gets answered. So the money going to per parcel still continues. That has
correct. That doesn't change.
I think it did in the House, and that may have precipitated, I think, some of the concern.
Yeah.
Okay. So
there is also, one thing I didn't mention in here, there's a whole section in the bill that we worked really hard on in Senate GovOps about data collection and defining the types of data that we would like the tax department to try to collect that are related to property valuations and property types. And we spent a lot of time with the tax department. It was like we were speaking one language and they were speaking another language, until we finally, Abby and I had a light bulb that it was that we were using property categories, and that meant something completely different to them than it meant to us. And as soon as we said, no, property types and characteristics, they were like, oh, we can do that. It was one of those wonderful moments where everybody started speaking the same language. So there's work in here from the tax department to collect information about property types and characteristics that can be used a lot for policy making. You know, we've had a lot of proposals, the quote unquote second home tax or the mansion tax or whatever, but also in housing. So the tax department got a lot of information and requests for data from the Department of Housing or whatever it's called, and ACCD. And so they worked with them to say, what kind of data would you like us to collect? So a lot of this is about creating better data collection that could be used for policy or for just for the department to figure out what's going on with properties. I will also say the tax department, we worked really closely with Rebecca Samaroff, and she was like almost gleeful about this bill. She liked it so much. So they're very excited to do all of this work. VLCT was fully supportive. VALA, was mixed. I think they're concerned about change, which is the Listers and Assessors Association. But we worked really hard to, as it came to us, VLCT and tax were not on board, and when it left our committee, they were.
Senator Stark, you had more questions, and then I'll move to Senator Lyons.
No, but as you're talking about this, it sounds like the consideration for the out-of-state increased real estate prices is going to be part of the consideration. And how are the realtors going to be engaged in this? Or is it strictly going to be based on property type and kind of establishing a baseline?
Some of that remains to be seen, but there is, when they're doing their work, they have to consult with a number of
Whole bunch of folks.
stakeholders, and the realtors came up as one of the obvious stakeholders. And also the renters association, we wanted to make sure it wasn't just people who own property, but also people who rented property. The thing that is, there is a $50,000 appropriation for the Department of Tax to do this work. And considering what we're asking them to do, I actually think that that is a bargain, because it's pretty complicated what we're asking them to do. And that was their request, was the $50,000. They would hire a consultant to work with the team to do all this work.
So trying to just bring this out in terms of what we're doing, there's the 50,000 for taxes to assist them in preparing for implementation, to do the necessary work. There's then the 100,000 from the education fund. We're preserving the per parcel fee. What will move forward then is the 6-year, setting that a cycle. And that came up before. We had a recommendation on the need to do that. And I can't remember where that came from. I remember hearing that from some organization that was good tax policy and a practice that was in place by, and I think maybe it was to deal with the not letting the CLA get so out of whack, which our current system says get out of whack and then you have to reappraise,
Right.
as opposed to just a cycle of keeping up to date. But is there anything else that's hidden in here, Senator Hardy, that's gonna give somebody heartburn?
I don't think so. I mean, you never know what might give
I
somebody
think the
heartburn.
House
but
pass version did.
The House pass version definitely gave a lot of people heartburn. We heard from a lot of local listers and assessors. We spent a whole day with people from all over the state coming in and talking to us. We spent a long time with the CT and a lot of time with the tax department to really perfect the sort of collection of data. So the only thing that really happens in here is the property reappraisal schedule. That is the schedule. The schedule is done by the state with flexibility, and then the locals continue to do it. And then there's just a lot of reporting, planning, data collection, report backs to us, and then improvements to the training for appraisers and listers. So I don't think there's anything that will give people heartburn. Sometimes, people get worried about what we are collecting data on, or worry about what we're studying, but it doesn't implement anything besides the schedule.
Senator Stark.
Yeah, I still haven't figured out what the big deal is of why, we got 2 days left here. Today and tomorrow, hopefully. And here we have a major bill that listers, that locals don't like, from what I've heard. And here we are trying to run it through at the 11th hour. Why not keep this and do your studying this summer if there still needs to be study, and bring it up? We have all next winter to deal with this. And I don't know, I just feel uneasy about when you start dealing with local property taxes and telling locals, it's gonna be done like this now, or done like this now. It has to be laid out and they have to be on board, from the listers to the clerks to the treasurers. I think we're biting off a pretty big bite here.
Timing is an issue, there's no question about that. Senator Sears.
Well, I think that you raised an important issue. The village that I live in is North Bennington. And the school is combined with Shaftesbury, a portion of Shaftesbury. So there's an independent school district, the village of North Bennington, which is part of the town of Bennington, and Shaftesbury. When Shasbury reappraises, my taxes go down. When we reappraise, my taxes go up. And we're not always on the same time. And obviously, school taxes are a lot of what we pay for property taxes. My municipal taxes are different, and it's not combined with two towns. So whenever Bennington appraises, things go up or down. So I agree with you, Senator. I think it's a huge problem if we don't have the towns behind us. That's where the problem comes in. And if that's true, then but I haven't heard that from my listeners, or maybe they don't know about the bill.
Well,
I think,
The league is
I'm sorry, the league is definitely supportive of the bill. I checked in with Karen Horn just again yesterday.
But only
to
the
make sure.
Senate, not what the House passed.
Right, the
That's
Senate
what
version
I
of the
think
bill.
it's
So I
hard
think
to
a lot of
sort out.
a lot of the concerns have been with the House version. And I guess I would just say that one of the problems we're trying to fix with the bill is that there's a huge backlog of reappraisals because of the change in property values over the last few years due to the pandemic and the influx of people and et cetera. So that is a problem that really needs to be worked through right now. And that's part of what the schedule will help sort of, parse out the most important things to do first. And the state would be able to help with that. They would not be doing the reappraisals. They would not be taking over anything besides the scheduling and working with the towns in order to do that. And then the other thing the bill does is exactly what you said, Senator Starr, which is to do all the studying and report back to us in December. So it doesn't implement, and even the schedule doesn't get implemented until 2025. This just gives them the time to do the schedule and then come back to us twice before that schedule gets put into effect.
I will say that we've had 2 Board of Abatement meetings during the session, and the first one was, we hate this bill because it was the House bill. And now the whole mood has changed, so I think it's.
Senator Westman.
It is, how are we going to handle, I have a number of towns that are in the place where they need to do their reappraisal. How does this handle that immediate problem?
If you have a town right now that needs to do a reappraisal.
And can't find people to appraise.
Right, so I think what this.
And they're facing the penalty.
Right, this will, and Abby, if you have anything to add, yeah, because, go ahead.
Can you tell me, is there a penalty, or is it just a calculation to adjust so that you're paying what you should be paying?
Exactly, there's not a penalty, and that's a misconception. What happens is that if
Because
you're.
I got this at legislative breakfast,
Yeah.
and Scott Beck, who understands education and property taxes better than I certainly ever would pretend to, made an explanation that you're not penalized.
Correct.
And he gave and maybe it would be helpful to give us a primer on that in terms of how that kicks in, what's it intended to do, but I didn't think it was a penalty. It was just a way of addressing that disparity. But if you could help.
Right, sure. So I can explain it a little bit, and then Abby, you can fill in with, because this came up in our committee too with the tax department there. So if you're at a CLA that's lower than 100%, that means that your property values are lower than they should be. And therefore your tax rate is going to be higher. To be able to collect the same amount of money for those properties in tax revenue, your tax rate has to be higher because your property values are too low.
We do that
And then-
adjustment all the time.
Yep, and then above, if your CLA is above 100, so maybe it's 110, it means your properties are overvalued, and therefore your tax rate is going to be lower because you need a lower tax rate to collect the same tax revenue from that property that's overvalued. So it's really a way of collecting the same amount of revenue with a differential tax rate based on the value of your property. And I'm assuming that's what Scott was talking about, because that's how it works. It's not a penalty. It's that if it gets undervalued, your tax rate has to go higher in order to collect the revenue of that.
Well, that adjustment is made all the time.
Yes, and has
But when
been for
you
years.
get to the 80
Yes.
percent range, what happens if I have a community that's at 76%?
So maybe you can
Yes,
help us
there's a
out.
distinction. Would you like me to?
Yes, if you could, that would be great. I'm sure Senator Hardy would be happy to share the end of the table.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel, you are getting at two different ways that the CLA is used. So the
Yes.
first is the way it impacts tax rates, so that the purpose behind that is to adjust to make sure that fair market value is as closely approximated as possible. That is also used to make up for the lag in reappraisal. So when that's more than, I think the international standard is every 4 or 5 years, and most Vermont towns are not meeting that. So the CLA is supposed to make up for that. Then you have the CLA as a trigger for a reappraisal, and there is, I wouldn't call it a penalty, but there is sort of a stick or teeth to not actually conducting the reappraisal. And in that case, the state can withhold funding to towns. So that's the per parcel fees, there are 2, and then any other funding that the state owes the town. So that is the stick.
So I have a number of communities that have gone well below the 80% level. Because
85 actually now.
Yeah, it's 85, but the department has never used the stick between 80 and 85. So when they go below the 80, that's when people get worried about the stick. So what are we doing about that? Because I have a number of communities that can't find appraisers to do the work, and they're on a schedule where I just had a community contract, and they're out almost 6 years.
But if we didn't pass this, we still got that problem.
You're gonna strike?
No, but I'm asking what this does to help that.
Okay,
So
no, I was
it's-
just wondering, if in fact, that's an issue that even if nothing was done here, we're gonna,
Well, we have to, that's the reason that we need to do some sort of a bill anyways, because we've got a number of communities that are facing that stick.
did finance deal with that?
So as it came out of the House and what is in the Senate Government Operations Committee amendment, it does repeal the CLA as a trigger going back to last year's grand list, so April 1st of
So it would deal
2022,
with
but
that.
it doesn't, it's not appropriating money to fund new appraisers, for example, that it
So,
doesn't.
but what it does is it appeals that stick.
Correct,
Okay.
yes.
This bill repeals the stick?
Yes.
Repeals
Well,
the
then you would
CLA.
like it.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to figure out what it does, so I can tell my towns, this is
Yeah.
what
Oh,
they're
because we
facing.
recognize the problem that we've created here, and by not staggering and having a predictability, we've created, particularly when you've got a lot of volatility in your values, so now we're getting rid of the stick, which is.
I will start my floor report with that, okay?
Yeah, but because that's what we,
Yeah.
that,
Very small.
because I've got listers all over asking, what are you gonna do about this? And I've got.
You basically said nothing, I'm waiting for others to do something.
No, no,
Now he can say he voted for a bill that gets rid of it.
Yeah, good.
Oh, all right, well, that's very helpful.
Thank you, Abby.
To,
My
explain, if what that calibration is
Zeroing
going
in
on all
on
the
the
time.
Yes,
And
there
then-
we go.
And then if you get too out of whack, then there is, obviously, then there is a mechanism to step in to correct the
Yes.
situation. Or to say, if you don't address it, you're gonna experience some fiscal impact from failing to do so. But that got that's being,
The CLA is being removed.
Part of the,
okay.
Senator Hardy said the coefficient of dispersion would still remain a trigger. So if there's disparity between one town's grand list values, that could still trigger.
Internal to the town.
Internal, exactly.
Wait a minute,
And
it's only
this-
partially repealing the stick.
It's repealing one of the sticks.
what does that
But it
mean?
is now including the 6-year reappraisal.
I'm getting less and less excited about this now.
Oh, so if-
What are they not, I mean, what towns would be required to do what they can't do because they can't find an appraiser.
If a town is found, so this is through the equalization study, so the tax department looks backwards 3 years at property transfer tax data, so sales, and then they come up with, this is what fair market value for your grand list should be, and then that's how they calculate the CLA. I'm not a, JFO could
But
explain
they
that.
would then,
CLA,
if the CLA is
This,
out of whack, then the town would be required to do a reappraisal, even though
under
they can't
current
do it.
law, under current law, and
But
that CLA is
we're not
being
repealing
repealed.
that?
That the CLA is being repealed as the trigger,
The only
Going
trigger
back
would be
to
this
last year.
coefficient of dispersion.
and
The
it will,
coefficient is what?
But that's internal to the
That's
town.
internal.
That's not influenced by, like your example of multiple towns.
So,
It's basically if your property, somebody else is getting a free ride and you're paying more because your appraisals internal to your town are out of kilter relative to those property owners.
Equal property.
but the towns have no control over what happens in the real estate market.
That's
other
why I
words,
asked the
people-
question earlier,
yeah.
but it's not, if that is a huge issue that maybe finance could.
Well, I don't, I
I think
appreciate that
anyone
at least we're limiting it to some extent, but I'm concerned that towns that have, seen McMansions being built and towns where, I had a friend of mine that decided to move to Rhode Island because to be closer to his kids. And he sold his house in Stowe for an unbelievable amount. He couldn't even believe he got that much.
We're hoping Senator Bruce will be in that boat.
Exactly.
Yeah, the other way. Wait, the other
It
way.
slowed down a little bit since the Fed hiked the interest rates, but it's still a huge
It's
problem in
amazing.
some communities.
Amazing.
And,
Willing seller, willing buyer.
You know,
We don't
people-
have rent
people are
or
buying
sales
un-
controls.
they don't even see the house, they buy it, and then they're surprised they're right next to a dump.
Do you know how often that coefficient of dispersion gets kicked in? Was it pretty rare?
do not know, I could maybe look in the P, or you can, I don't know either, it's much less rare than the CLA. The CLA is the one, that's the bigger stick, so we are repealing the bigger
But
stick.
the run up in real estate prices now have just exacerbated.
That would, all right, so that would suggest though, that's generally on residential property that we're seeing that. It's not so much on
In the
business.
current, in the
In the
current.
current market. So that would trigger the local listers or assessors to do the, update the town, right? I mean,
So although the CLA is repealed
But-
as the trigger,
but I suppose it, I'm sorry, Stephanie.
It could make locally adjustments to certain classes of property when they look at their land schedule or their pieces like that.
They can do that.
and then there is, as Senator Hardy mentioned, there is the
Back into-
6-year
Yeah.
schedule that goes in, but with some discretion for property valuation
But
reviews.
that coefficient of dispersion that can be addressed locally. Right?
Yes,
but
yes,
that's-
it is,
Yes, yeah,
Without a full reappraisal.
yes, yeah. I think that's the important thing.
And reappraise certain properties.
Yes.
So the payment, sorry.
No, Senator
So the
Westbrook said-
payment to the towns, if we're removing the stick, or at least the biggest piece of the stick that will help my communities that are facing the issue where they've had this huge run up. If we're going to every 6 years, and the towns are still going to have to pay for the appraisals, is the payment that we offer to the towns going to be enough to meet the cost of the reappraisal every 6 years? Or is that, because I'm gonna hear from communities that now you're making me do this every 6 years, whether the market's been going up or down or not. And we're doing it mostly to fuel money for the ed fund. And my communities, if they have to, on their municipal side, come up with that money, they're not gonna like it.
So can I,
So
I'll
is
answer
the-
that,
So is
yes.
the $8 and something, enough to cover their.
Well, maybe
So
that's part of their
when they
study.
do the study about, first of all, the department shall prioritize in the first round, this is to get the center purchase list question, municipalities for which the last year of reappraisal is the oldest, the geographic proximity of municipalities and any other relevant municipal data metrics. And then in terms of the recommendations for implementing the proposed schedule, whether there's adequate funding, including cost-saving measures and potentially reallocating the revenues of the per parcel fee, administration of full and statistical reappraisals of each municipality's municipal and statewide education grant list, selection and prioritization criteria, any proposed adjustments to the coefficient of dispersion threshold that causes a reappraisal, frequency and efficacy of conducting full and statistical reappraisals on a set schedule, and any other recommendations for establishing a reappraisal schedule. So that's what they have to come back and report to us about, the schedule of the reappraisal. So we tried to take into consideration many of these questions that you're asking before there's a schedule that's in place.
At Center Lyons, and I'm just thinking about the time. We hope to be out of here tomorrow, maybe Saturday. The House can stay until Saturday. Time is ticking. On the other hand, there's some relief in this bill relative to towns. So we could say, oh, well, we'll study it, or not take action, but then we're gonna have the problem that Senator Westman's talking about relative to the CLA. And the towns can't do anything, really, because it can't, apparently, there's just too much going on. So I'm just getting into the time sensitivity issue related to this bill and what the bill does. Obviously, how the House did it caused a lot of, it made crossover, I gather.
It did make crossover, and it's been sitting in finance for a while. We worked on it for, I think, 2 weeks in GovOps. And then it's been in finance.
Just curious, has the House indicated if they would be okay with the Senate?
I'm in talking to the chair of Ways and Means, they would concur if it's sent over in this form.
So the other thing to keep in mind is we have the override session. The Speaker and I have talked about limiting that to overrides and things that got stuck.
That's what I'm wondering about time.
Yeah, so this would come up for them in the override.
So we would not,
If it
that
traveled under-
session would be more than dealing with vetoes, you have to deal with other bills.
Because that question for the communities, they're so far out of whack. And they're facing this run up that the COVID thing, they're desperate to get some answer from us about that.
Okay, so,
You said what I was gonna say.
oh, all right, it's just trying to figure out the time and what this does. It's a hugely complicated system when you get into coefficient. I first heard of that in Newbury.
Oh,
I gotta tell you, one of the things that's been most frustrating.
And it wasn't related to anything.
oh, wasn't related to anything.
No, one of the things that's been most frustrating is, and I don't know if other chairs have had that problem, but I have had nothing but holding bills up to the last minute when there's, even after morning committees are shut down, and I get the bills from the House with little or no time to work on them. I think it's
I'm not getting bills from the House.
well, at least I'm getting them. I guess I should feel fortunate, but it makes it very difficult to try to work your way through when you get it at the last minute and actually after your committee shut down formally.
Well, it sounds like they made crossover on this.
Yeah,
one.
this was not the last minute. It's just had to go through 3 Senate committees. So that made it take longer.
So it went first to finance?
It went first to GovOps, and we made a lot of changes to it, and then
Obviously.
finance made just 2 small changes. They they made some technical changes, and then they add to the study whether or not to change when the property, when the grand list is lodged officially out and the town's done setting values. It's now April 1st, and they suggested looking at whether another date made more sense, January 1st or something like that. So it's just adding to the study.
Senator Bridges.
Just one question, since it's coming from the education fund, it's kind of going to administration, that we don't have to understand that section of law that doesn't allow.
Abby can speak
education.
to that, I'm sure, because this is protecting the grand list,
Yes.
statewide grand
I
list.
did actually want to clarify that because there's already an existing appropriation of $100,000 from the education fund, and the change is totally technical. It's just moving it into a different section of statute, and that is an authorized use.
Okay.
Yeah, already.
Yeah, sorry if I muddied that water.
No,
The appropriations is
beneficiary.
50.
Right, no, it makes sense, I just didn't know if it was an authorized use.
I'll move the bill.
Now that you,
Yeah.
all right.
Now
Now
that
that
we-
we- No, that the stick.
Now that the big stick has been broken.
Big stick.
I was worried about that stick.
So
I don't know.
So I will ask, it would take a rule suspension.
Okay.
So I'll ask the minority leader what he thinks. Might help. He's probably not gonna know the ins and outs, although finance.
he's in finance, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I can ask him and see.
So the appropriations here are quite modest. We've already accounted for the 50,000 because it came over from the House side with the money. The other parts,
Which are ongoing.
yeah, as Abby said, that was just a technical, it's already there, it's just a technical change. So the only thing here would be giving the tax department money to do the study work and then come back. We're not doing anything with the per parcel fee at this point. And you said the league now with the changes made support the bill.
Yes, they do. The league supports the bill, yes.
And the Association for Listers and Assessors, are they still?
I think they are mixed. I think officially they were not thrilled with the bill, but if you talk to individual listers and assessors, some of them like it and think it's a good thing. Some of them are a little worried.
Are they worried about the 6 year setting, getting a fixed schedule?
I think
or-
they're worried about the 6 years and how it might work, and then they're worried about the looming potential of the state taking over. But again, that doesn't, it's just studied in here, it doesn't actually happen, and there's,
Even if the state took over, we don't have enough people trained here to do it.
right,
And
so,
we, I look at this and say, I appreciate your 100,000 and we have to really think how we're gonna get people out there to do this work.
and that, I think that's part of what they're trying to put into
And
the-
some towns, the charters have actually moved from listers to a hired assessor for that reason.
Yeah.
Because it's very hard to get people who wanna do the job and more on a volunteer basis. I know it's not volunteer, but it's still a lot of work
Mhm.
being a lister, and nobody loves listers either.
I like my listers.
Well,
Can we have a second?
well, we,
I did.
Are you
And then-
voting?
yes, we're gonna
Yeah, it's
vote
taking so
on.
long.
This is
Oh,
sort of low clerk.
Richie's always slow.
Yes.
So,
Mines,
Yes.
Birchlick,
Yes,
Sears,
Yes.
Star,
I'll vote to get it out of committee.
Westman's, yes.
he wants that stick left, apparently.
Well,
Yes.
all
Yeah.
sticks.
You could divide the
I
questions.
think we should reconsider the clerk's position. I think that.
I'm overpaid.
Some stick.
Okay, so,
I think you're padding your pocket for your clerk position.
taxes, are you taxes?
I am taxes, yes.
Oh my God, he does all the good things.
I know, he's got
Is
compacts.
this is not de minimis.
This is not the-
I was so happy to get to say de minimis 3
Come
times.
to the caucus is now at 12:15.
Happening.
You will be here.
You wanna talk about the
What do we
education?
have caucus on?
Election.
The election. You want to talk more about
That was screwed.
Jesus.
what?
Kill it.
Yes, we should end.
Last slide.
Yes, we're gonna